David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So one of the moves that we knew the Trump administration would be trying to make pretty quickly after Trump's inauguration was to move the embassy of the United States in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I've explained why this is an absolutely terrible idea. And the gist of it is that within Israel, there are, of course, many people that consider Jerusalem to be the capital of the country. But internationally, Jerusalem is a disputed territory. It's sort of like if internationally Washington, D.C. was the capital of the United States. But imagine that internally, we sort of thought that New York was our capital, but we were in a land dispute with Canada over New York, right? Sort of an analogous situation, an imaginary analogy. Currently, West Jerusalem is considered part of Israel. East Jerusalem is considered part of the Palestinian territories, with the old city within that under Israeli control, but with a particular part of the old city with jurisdiction given back to the Palestinian Authority. Very complicated situation. But the long and short of it is that the future of Jerusalem is, by all reasonable accounts, part of what would be negotiated in a peace agreement, hypothetically, if we ever got to that point again. And of course, with Jared Kushner leading that crusade, doesn't seem like we're going to get there anytime soon. So internationally, Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. That's where the United States has had its embassy. Donald Trump's choice for ambassador to Israel, we learned pretty early on, was going to be and eventually became David Friedman. And as soon as we knew that David Friedman was going to be the guy to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel, we knew that a top priority would be to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Friedman is the epitome of a right-wing extremist on the issue of Israel. He is of the mindset that more settlements are good, which is in the spectrum of views on settlements. To really understand how wacky that position is, you've got to understand what the sort of range of positions is. And the range tends to be something like demolish all settlements and get out completely, give that land back to Palestinians. Stop building new ones, but presume that existing settlements may be allowed to stay if there are meaningful land swaps in exchange as part of a peace agreement. Get the current settlements to stay, but only if there's some kind of integration with Palestinians, right? There's all these sort of different views. The extremist view is not only are the settlements not a problem, but we should be building even more settlements. And that's the view of Donald Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. So completely retrograde on that issue. And Trump has been touting that moving the embassy to Jerusalem will actually be a good thing with respect to possible peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, because it'll take Jerusalem off the table, right? Trump's idea is, listen, right now, the issue of Jerusalem is a negotiating issue. If we just move the embassy to Jerusalem and, more importantly, recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, we're taking it off the table for future negotiations. And of course, I cannot imagine a more short-sighted and childish view of the situation. The unilateral decision to move the embassy without it being part of an agreement is only going to inflame the situation and make it more difficult to even get people to the table to do the negotiation. And of course, violence is escalating completely predictably. At least 25 already dead in the Gaza Strip in the midst of growing protests against this move of the embassy. Hamas, of course, benefiting greatly, vowing even more protests. Hamas, as I've told you, always acting with no regard whatsoever for the safety of the Palestinian people. And this will in turn be used to justify even more pushback by Israeli forces, and the cycle continues, this endless cycle. And at the end of the day, we see who it is that influences Donald Trump. It's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a vile right-winger connected to the most extreme elements of the Israeli political spectrum. He has gotten just major concessions from Trump over the last several weeks. Trump has announced that he's going to pull the United States out of the Iran deal, which Netanyahu, of course, loves hearing from Donald Trump. It's a totally backwards move geopolitically. Trump now following through on moving the embassy to Jerusalem, initially a sort of provisional embassy with a bigger build out coming in the future. That's another move that strengthens Benjamin Netanyahu's hardliner stance. And at this point, I'm genuinely unsure about whether Netanyahu has even offered Donald Trump anything in response for all of this, right? In other words, did Netanyahu simply manipulate Trump into doing what he wants Trump to do without having to offer anything? Or is there some quid pro quo here, right? Either real or promised or hypothetical going on in the background. It's possible that there is a quid pro quo. It's also very possible that Donald Trump has merely done this because he's convinced that it's the correct or cool thing to do, and Benjamin Netanyahu has bamboozled him into doing it. And when we talk about the future of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, a guy who is the subject of multiple criminal investigations, a guy whose wife is also being looked into for criminal activity, it's the type of guy Trump loves, right? Benjamin Netanyahu is in the direction, although not clearly as far as people like Rodrigo Duterte and President Erdogan of Turkey and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. These are the types that Trump likes, and that's why it's not even remotely surprising that Netanyahu seems to have, and Putin, who can forget Putin? Netanyahu seems to have Donald Trump effectively wrapped around his finger. Disastrous decision made here, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about the horrible consequences over the coming weeks and months. Let's reset what's going on with Trump attorney Michael Cohen. We learned last week, because of initially tweets from Stormy Daniels' attorney, Michael Hannity, we learned that Michael Cohen, through a shell company called Essential Consultants, was the recipient of more than $1 million that we know of specifically, and allegedly of more than $4 million of basically influence money. $600,000 from AT&T, $1.2 million from Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis, reportedly $500,000 from a Putin-connected Russian business owner billionaire, and allegedly many, many other transfers of money. And supposedly the reason that these companies were paying Michael Cohen's consulting firm was for insights into the Trump administration. And of course, the timing was very suspect. The timing of the AT&T money, $600,000, not $200,000 as originally reported, coincided with not only the repeal of net neutrality by the Trump FCC, but also with the fact that AT&T was trying to merge with Time Warner. The Washington Post has now obtained internal AT&T documents, meaning this is what AT&T wrote internally about the real reasons why they were paying money to Michael Cohen. And the internal documents from AT&T indicate that hiring Michael Cohen was done to help with the Time Warner merger. AT&T hired the personal attorney of the President of the United States to provide advice about a merger which Trump's own Department of Justice would be adjudicating. So this is a story about corruption fundamentally. It should not be a partisan story because corruption cuts both ways, much like freedom of the press. And it can be very tempting to look the other way when the lack of press freedom or of corrosive corruption is helping your side. But that's how we end up screwing ourselves in the long run. And this is quickly growing to the level of, I don't know, to pick an example, the corruption during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, which was considered huge, right? It included Black Friday. It included a major railroad scam. It included the whiskey ring, pond scum corruption and cronyism. What we are seeing now under the Trump administration in terms of corruption and cronyism is rising above and beyond even what we saw under President Ulysses S. Grant. And this is circumstantially evidence of bribery, right? The AT&T hiring of Michael Cohen, Novartis, the other companies we're learning about. And it's not about bribery, the crime, yet, but it is deduced evidence of intent to bribe and receive bribes, and it has to be looked into. And Americans should be united on this. They're not. And that is really one of the scariest things that we're seeing about the looking the other way on Trump-Russia, looking the other way on the cronyism, looking the other way on the broader bamboozling that has taken place, because this has every indication of being pay to play, which, by the way, Trump said was a reason not to vote for Hillary, selling access directly or indirectly, explicitly or implicitly to the President of the United States. And we only have the information so far about some of the more than $4 million that supposedly ran through this one company of Cohen's, Essential Consultants. I would be willing to bet that there is much more, and I hope that we learn about it soon. And it's important. I mentioned legally, right? Some will say, okay, AT&T paid Cohen to help get the merger approved. Trump hates CNN, owned by Time Warner. Trump opposed the deal anyway. Is it still illegal? Is it still bribery, even if it wasn't successful bribery? And the answer from legal experts is yes. The offer of a quid pro quo is what makes it bribery. Taking money to help get a merger through, getting screwed because Trump's Justice Department ended up opposing it, doesn't excuse the bribery. We could call it stupid bribery. We could call it failed bribery. But it is still bribery. And of course, whether there's going to be any legal repercussions remains to be seen. I am really disappointed that we're not seeing both sides put their foot down and say, this is not democracy.
Right, and because corruption is everywhere in our politics, it's unclear as to whether or not Michael Cohen even committed a crime here. But if he did commit a crime, you have to imagine that Robert Mueller would use that to his advantage because he already has Michael Cohen at the palm of his hand, right? If he's using,
you would think,
with the Russia stuff and the Stormy Daniels stuff, he could use this as leverage too. Maybe that would cause Michael Cohen to flip on Trump.
That's increasingly the discussion. I mean, we've known that Cohen has been a likely indictee of Robert Mueller for a while. And at this point, the questions are, number one, is this something Mueller is concerned with? We believe the answer is yes, because we know Cohen spoke to both AT&T and Novartis months ago. So clearly Cohen knows about this. Question two, is there a point at which Michael Cohen's supposed love of Donald Trump, just thinking he's just the best guy out there, is there a point at which it would become too much pressure even on Cohen, and Cohen does flip? I don't know the answer to that, but it is something that we may soon learn. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And boy, do we have a good program for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Want to say thanks to a couple of great people. Charles Babb is today's new member of the day. Membership is our primary source of funding. You can learn more at joinpakman.com. Also want to thank Stephen McLaughlin, who's been a member since 2012, long-term member of the day. Thanks to Charles, thanks to Stephen, thanks to everybody who supports our work. Get all the member benefits by joining at joinpakman.com. You can also make a pledge on Patreon at patreon.com/DavidPakmanShow. And very quickly, Tom Baker has donated half of 15 memberships. So normal yearly membership is $60. Tom got in touch over the weekend, said, David, I want to pay for half of 15 memberships. He has already done that, meaning that there are 15 half-price memberships available to you, okay? Tom's already paid for half. If you want to pay $30, you get a year membership at half price. You can keep that half-price membership as long as you want. Just get in touch with me through our website contact form. Go to davidpakman.com, click on contact, get in touch with me, say, I want one of Tom Baker's memberships. 15 of these are available, and I will send out coupon codes in order of received emails. Okay, during the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump campaigned on pharmaceutical drug prices being too high, and that one of his priorities was going to be to negotiate lower prices. He was going to be tough. It was going to be great for consumers, great for patients, great for everybody except the drug companies. And of course, that quickly changed when right after winning the election, Trump met with a bunch of big pharma executives and lobbyists. And he came out of that meeting and all of a sudden he wasn't concerned about drug prices anymore. And now he's gone completely in the other direction, saying that in other countries, governments have negotiated drug prices that are simply too low. And he's calling it the extortion of big pharma. Trump said that, quote, it's time to end the global freeloading once and for all, and that the price controls that other countries have negotiated with big pharma are, quote, extortion of, quote, unreasonably low prices from drug makers. What's the point of all this? Why is Trump even talking about this? The reason is Trump is arguing that if other countries didn't extort low prices from big pharma, the U.S. would have cheaper prices because we wouldn't be subsidizing the low prices of other countries. And this is one of the most simplistic and naive views of drug pricing that I've maybe ever heard from a president. Trump's basically saying, if you allow drug makers to charge more in other countries, they'd say, hey, you know what? We're making more in other countries. Let's lower prices here in the US, since after all, we don't need to make all that money. After all, what are we, for-profit companies? Oh yeah, we are. And this is ridiculous at its face, and experts agree it's ridiculous. There's a professor of health policy, Paul Ginsberg, who says the obvious, which is big pharma sets prices to maximize profits, right? They will charge the most they can profitably charge in Europe, and then they will charge the most that they can profitably charge in the United States. If they can charge more in Europe or Asia or South America, they will, and they'll make more money. And they're not going to then charge less in the United States because they're making more money in Europe or Asia or South America. And in fact, the market recognized this, because when Trump said this thing, which effectively means let's get prices up in other countries, the market thought this was great, and pharmaceutical company stock prices jumped, right? If this was really zero sum, if as prices went up in Europe, they were to come down in the United States, if that was expected, you wouldn't see the markets so excited over Donald Trump talking about pushing up big pharmaceutical prices in other countries. The reason the stocks went up is that this will be a net gain. They'll charge a lot in the United States, and they'll charge more in other countries. And truly, think about how dumb this argument is, right? Trump's saying that the low prices in other countries are extortion. Pharmaceutical companies aren't forced to do business in other countries. If the prices in France, for example, were too low, then any pharmaceutical company could say, we're not going to do business in France anymore because we're losing money. If they're making enough money in those other countries to continue doing business there, clearly it's to their advantage to continue doing business. And this also, by the way, I was thinking of the horrible timing of this. We just found out that $1.2 million flowed from Novartis to Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, for insights into the Trump administration. Not exactly the best time for Trump to be talking about bringing drug prices up, right? When we find out that actually his personal attorney was receiving all sorts of money from Novartis for healthcare policy work, as we learned last week. And when Trump said he was going to negotiate lower drug prices for Americans, I guess what he meant was force prices up in other parts of the world so that Americans won't think they're getting screwed anymore because the prices will be really high everywhere. I genuinely don't know, but that appears to be his idea.
This guy said that wages are too high in America, and still he got elected.
Yeah.
So this isn't really a surprise now.
Not a surprise at all. And shocking, the con man isn't really going to lower drug prices here in the United States. We've talked about the Trump presidency as the sort of Fox News presidency. Trump watches Fox News in the morning, Fox and Friends. His first tweets of the day are often based on what was covered on Fox and Friends that morning. We also know that Trump shares an advisor with Sean Hannity in attorney Michael Cohen. Whether or not Cohen was ever officially representing Sean Hannity in a legal capacity, we don't really know. But we know that Cohen and Hannity are in touch and that Hannity has obtained advice from Cohen. So a lot of connections between Trump and Fox News. And there's now a new report from New York Magazine, which points out that on many nights of the week, Trump and Hannity are having, oddly enough, bedtime phone calls. Trump is effectively being put to bed by Fox News propagandist Sean Hannity, and Hannity is reportedly on a list of cleared friends and family at the White House switchboard. He gets right through to Donald Trump when he calls, and Trump's routine is increasingly becoming clear on a day-to-day basis. In the morning, Trump will watch Fox News and tweet on the basis of what it is he sees on TV. He watches Fox and Friends. In the evenings, he talks to Sean Hannity. And I was thinking as I read this very interesting article in New York Magazine, could the contrast be starker to President Obama, who would read as much as possible? He would read fiction and nonfiction on his own, and he would read just copious political documents in the mornings and throughout the day. And there could be no more antithetical behavior to that of Barack Obama when it comes to reading than what we're seeing from Trump. And what New York Magazine also points out is that the morning Fox and Friends routine is not just Trump's doing. Clearly, Trump likes watching Fox and Friends, but apparently when Sean Spicer and Reince Priebus were still press secretary and chief of staff, respectively, they noticed that when Trump would get up and watch Morning Joe, for example, or other channels, those had some less than glowing reports about Trump, and Trump would get so agitated that it would throw off his entire day. So what Priebus and Spicer decided, in a sense it's brilliant, was get Trump to watch Fox and Friends in the morning because it keeps him more calm and stable because they mostly just talk about how great Trump is. This is like managing a little kid, right? It's like he's got the two times a day propaganda file to placate him. He's deliberately been transitioned by staff off of Morning Joe over to Fox and Friends. It's like dealing with either a kid or a developmentally delayed adult.
Yeah, at the beginning of his presidency, it wasn't great that he was only watching cable news.
Right.
Wasn't really reading articles or getting those presidential daily briefings.
Sure.
But at least he was getting somewhat of a diversity of opinions. Like, you had people in the center, you had people on the left who would criticize him, and then you had Fox News.
Sure.
Now it's just Fox News.
It's exclusive. And the Fox News diet obviously has its own problems, and current officials are admitting, like, here's the problem. Fox News sometimes exaggerates, shocking, and they also leave out major stories. If it's a story that at its base isn't a good story for Trump to be, for the Trumpists, Fox News will often just not cover it. So Trump becomes fixated because of his Fox News diet on small, insignificant stories that Fox News focuses on and is completely in the dark about actual major stories that are relevant in the grand scheme of things. So it's very, very disturbing what's going on with Trump's media diet. But to get back to the Hannity phone calls for a second, Hannity's role is a little different than Fox and Friends. Hannity's calls with Trump often leave Trump feeling like he's just making the right decision about everything, right? Hannity pumps him up to think he's accomplished amazing things. Trump will come away from these phone calls with Hannity with new ideas for executive orders he wants to put through. And a former White House official calls the Hannity phone calls an effed up feedback loop that really messes with Trump's head. So the big picture is Hannity and Fox and Friends are running our country. Fox News Corporation President Rupert Murdoch reportedly also on that list of people who can get right through at the White House switchboard to Donald Trump. And there's really just no comparison to what's happening at the White House. And I was just thinking, George W. Bush is really benefiting from Donald Trump being president, and the Washington Post put out an article to that extent. And it is stunning. I mean, George W. Bush was a terrible president, right? He made some of the worst political decisions in a long time, disastrous economy, went to war under false pretenses, led to thousands, tens of thousands of civilian and military deaths. And the approval rating retrospectively for George W. Bush is way up because the contrast to Donald Trump makes people say, hey, Bush wasn't really that bad. And that's dangerous, number one, because I've talked before about the last thing we want to do is get fooled into seeing the disastrous neocon Bush doctrine of the Project for a New American Century as anything short of horrifying. But it's true that compared to what we're seeing, I mean, Bush at least read books, right? They weren't the books I might have chosen necessarily, but the guy was at least reading. So this is really, really scary stuff. And by the way, yet another link between the Trump administration and Julian Assange. Remember that Julian Assange was in touch with Donald Trump Jr. during the campaign, who of course is directly linked to Donald Trump. Julian Assange was also in touch with John Hannity during the campaign, which is yet another way in which it's completely plausible that the Trump administration was in touch with Assange and WikiLeaks.
It's another mutual point of contact for them, just like Michael Cohen is.
Yeah.
And one more thing on Hannity. I mean, when Hannity's done, when his show's over at 10 o'clock p.m., do you really want to watch Laura Ingraham, or do you want to get the bonus Hannity? And I think that's what Trump is opting to do.
Yeah. Where do we know what Trump thinks about Laura Ingraham? I don't know. Is that something
I don't think he has an
on?
opinion on Laura Ingraham.
He hasn't taken a position? Yeah. That show is unwatchable, by the way, and hopefully it'll be off the air soon. I've got an absolutely horrifying story for you from India, where 3 teenage girls have been raped and set on fire during a 1-week period. 2 of them died, 1 left in critical condition. It's believed that these are 3 separate cases, not related. The perpetrators in the 3 cases are different, no apparent connection. But I want to talk specifically about the case of the first of the 3 victims. The girl was kidnapped and raped. The girl's father sought retribution through the village council, which is a relatively common apparatus that exists in some of these rural parts of India. It's a common system. And the council ordered that the 4 men who were the perpetrators to do 100 sit-ups each and pay the girl's family a fine of $700. This is a ridiculous penalty to begin with. But then the men were angry that they had been reported on. They broke into the family home again, beat up the victim's parents, took the girl, set her on fire, and killed her. There are now a total of 20 people being investigated for the attack, and officials say that they want to look at punishing the entire village for trivializing the rape with this ridiculous verdict of 100 sit-ups and a $700 fine. And the story's been incorrectly reported as the government gave out a penalty of 100 sit-ups and a $700 fine. That's not true, right? This was one of these village councils, which are part of the problem. And often they look the other way on honor killings. They look the other way on child marriage. And this is where there are people who are off the rails with the cultural relativism topic. Like with most things, life exists on a sliding scale. So very often there's this conversation, do you believe in cultural relativism or don't you? And of course the answer is, well, what are you talking about, right? Do I believe that there are any circumstances where you can defend 100 sit-ups as a fine for rape? No. Do I believe there are any cultural factors that would make it acceptable to have public beheadings in Saudi Arabia because, hey, this is their culture and we can't judge it? No, we can judge it, and that's absolutely ridiculous. Now, do I think that cultural relativism in a totally benign way can explain such phenomena as why there are different breakfast foods in different countries, for example? Sure, and it's just not really a big deal, and it is an example of cultural relativism. Do I believe that hang-ups about nudity that exist in the US but not in other parts of the world where beaches are just all topless, is that an example of cultural relativism that doesn't really require judgment on our behalf of what's better or worse? Yeah, that's a real thing. That's cultural relativism, and it's not a big deal. So back to this story, those who claim that it's wrong to say it's completely ridiculous to leave the decisions on something like rape of kids to village councils who might say 100 sit-ups and $700 as a fine is okay. No, I don't agree with that. I think that it is completely cut and dry that this is unacceptable. And this is why I've said before, coming up with the principles for your life is fine. But the real tough part is applying it. And in this case, saying we believe in cultural relativism or that we don't is not really that useful to us. Knowing where to draw the line is what's useful, and it's difficult. Honor killings and sit-up punishments for rape, that's very clearly on the other side of the line. Nudity at beaches in front of little kids or swearing on TV at any time of the day, breakfast foods, that's clearly on this side of the line. And the problem in practice is, where do you draw the line? And as far as India is concerned, a lot of these rural areas have the village councils. They're so rural that there's very little law enforcement, very little judicial presence. So it's not quite so simple, even if you could do it politically, to say the village council is no longer going to be the sort of law enforcement apparatus. So as with most things, it's more complex in practice, but morally, there is absolutely nothing complicated here. Discuss this with us on our subreddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Jeremy Baumberg, who's a professor of nanoscience at the University of Cambridge, also author of the new book, The Secret Life of Science. Jeremy, it's so great to talk to you. One place I want to start is one that we've been discussing for a long time, and it relates to a talking point that you sometimes hear thrown about in popular culture, that for some people, science is equivalent to a religion, that it works like a religion. And one of the most interesting things about science to me that really differentiates it from religion, aside from all of the other obvious ways, is that rather than sort of creating an echo chamber, it actually encourages the disproof of what are often considered the sort of common sense or accepted explanations for phenomena. In fact, there's sort of like great rewards for doing so. And you address that in the book, but you also point out that that sort of free market, Wild West element of science can really narrow the focus of many scientists. So let's start maybe there. Talk a little bit about how you believe the science world is functioning in general at this time.
Okay, it's a really interesting question because it combines I guess, two aspects that scientists like. One of them is this sense of a mainstream, something that everybody agrees on, that is very robust, I think. That's what's one of the amazing things about science, that really doesn't make it a religion, that is generally, even though people might have sometimes maverick results that might even get published, actually what happens is this huge amount of science which is building in different directions. It's like a sort of I imagine like a big web of a sort of forest of tree trunks, enormous things. And if you add something that doesn't fit, it just gets papered over and lost. And really the thing is incredibly robust. Otherwise, everything would come crashing down. At the same time, as you say, in this sort of competitive system that we have, there are huge rewards for showing that something is completely different. So trying to build a new branch in a completely different direction in sort of an empty void that was never there before. And the interesting thing is how difficult it is to do that. You have to convince everybody, because you start growing a little sapling in some particular area, and if it really isn't robust, it just falls off, it withers away. But that's how science sort of works, is that some of these ideas actually are correct, and then we build on them, and the whole enterprise incorporates that into the fabric. So I think that the strong thing about it is it evolves. It's not completely static. It does evolve, and for that, this sort of web of really strong results is one of the strong things about science. It's what's in good shape. And yet at the same time, the competition encourages people to find something different, something new that will gain them huge notoriety and therefore success. But they have to convince everybody else that that's correct. So that the tension between those sides is partly good. What we might ask is, of the money, of the huge amount of resources we put into science, are we using it most efficiently to find those new places?
Yeah, that always seems to be, I mean, here in the United States, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a political movement which likes to focus on such financial subjects as waste and debt and government spending. And it's become very, very popular to find very particular scientific projects that look at, the mating rituals of the manatee only during April of odd-numbered years, right? I mean, of course, that's not a real one,
my
but
favorite thing
it's always caricatured, right?
My favorite example is actually showing, does moonlight make plants grow?
Exactly. And very often,
very, very small amount.
These are presented as sort of examples of where science is doing something that's of no purpose or use or significance whatsoever. And I'm curious what your sense is of when that is brought up. Does it make sense to argue the merits of the particular scientific endeavor, or is there some broader meta-argument that is more logical in those conversations?
I think the first thing that's very important is that there is lots of investment in science, research in science, that just wouldn't happen without our governments funding it. And it's more and more the case. It used to be that we had big corporate labs, high tech had enough funding to actually go off and research things in new directions. And because finance is trying to be so efficient, all of this has gone. So companies have almost zero to really invest in research. A few big giants are able to go in certain areas and they make big noise about it. I used to work for Hitachi, and that was the same thing. They had a large amount of money, and a small amount was invested in really long-range science projects, which were impressive. But by and large, it's only really government funding that produces ideas that then can be taken forward. That, for me, is the thing to really concentrate on. Now, the difficulty is if we knew how to choose which projects we would, were the good ones, then there would be no problem. Then industry could just choose it. The difficulty is when we do science, we really don't know how it's going to pan out. There's a large amount of risk involved. So we have to fund in different directions. And the question is, how do we create a system which is most likely to choose directions that will show these new directions, unusual ones, as well as take the things that we want to improve forward with the highest likelihood? And because of the risky nature of science, that's a really difficult thing. Many scientists, many people will say, oh, we can pick the winners. But generally, people can't pick winners. There's a large amount of randomness involved. So, scientists often complain that their grant was not funded. But it's actually even more difficult to try and decide from a huge array of grants, which you can fund maybe a few % of them, which ones are the best investment for our society. And generally, scientists do approach that in a very impressive way, but actually, in the end, it's very difficult to do it. And that's why some of these other examples come around where it doesn't sound like, why did somebody choose this sort of project?
Do you think that in some sense, science is expanding in a way that is not the optimal way?
So one of the things that surprised me in this book, I actually started this book with no preconceptions at all. I just started to try and track down some answers to questions that I was experiencing, or people around me would complain about this or that. And I was figured, well, it's your system. Why don't you change it? It's nobody's making us do it this way. And as I started to try and understand it, I came across some things which I didn't expect to find them. And it turns out that most people don't know about them. So one of the things that I think is quite important to realize is how the number of scientists is increasing. So if I ask people, is the number of physicists in the world going up, or the number of chemists? I mean, most scientists don't know. Certainly the general public doesn't know. But actually it's increasing at about 4% a year. It's about 4 times the world population increase. So the world population is increasing by less than 1% now and dropping quite fast. But the number of scientists has been carrying on at this growth rate for over 50 years and shows no signs of stopping at all. And then there's an interesting question. Well, what happens as you put more people into science? It sounds like a good idea. More scientists should give you more science, more breakthroughs, and more development. It's not clear it works like that. Generally, when you put more scientists into science, they don't do all radically different things. They tend to clump around particular areas that are sort of hot, what we call bandwagon areas. So they end up sort of often replicating each other's work or competing very intensely, but to try and do the same things. And that's part of this ecosystem, this competition that is huge and ferocious within the science community. So the difficult thing, I think, is at some point, clearly there are going to be too many scientists. There probably were too few scientists in the past, but the question is, how do we decide what's the right number of scientists? We might say, well, the free market will just decide. At a certain point, our societies will decide, well, that's the number of scientists that we can fund. We don't just fund them in academia and universities. Also, industry funds a huge number of scientists, about half the number in the world, or a little bit more are actually within industry. And so we're paying for them through the products that we buy. And that might be, medical advances in a very large way. These investment is coming from a whole range of different directions, but still at the same time we're paying for them. So at some point we might say, well, we'll just stop doing that. Interestingly, it seems for most societies, when the number of scientists is a few percent, it rises to a certain amount of the GDP and it stops. And I always sort of joke that the reason it stops is because if you write a single page of what a country spends its money on, science funding stops when it actually appears on that page because it's got large enough. It's something like, a fraction of the medical budget, a tenth or something like that. And it's because then people say, well, what are we getting for our money? And it's very hard to decide because it's a very long-term investment.
Well, along those lines, Jeremy, two things I'm thinking of as I hear you saying this are, so you've got the increase in the number of scientists of 4%, which you cited. Would your view of that be different if, number one, funding for science increased in parallel with the increase in the number of scientists? Because it seems if you increase the number of scientists and not the funding, you're just taking the same amount of funding and splitting it into smaller and smaller pieces. But also if there was some mechanism to make sure that the areas of focus are diversified rather than this sort of clustering around the same areas.
So both of these, I think, are very important. So scientists themselves will tell you that it's harder and harder to get funding. And there's some truth in it. But of course, the budgets for science have always been going up. As far as I can see, they've never gone down. They are not, they're generally keeping pace also with the number of scientists, but they're very unequally spread. What's happened is also the aspiration of scientists to do more and more work has increased faster than the rate of funding. So, and that's partly because of globalization, actually. So scientists used to work in a smaller community, maybe their national community, maybe even their smaller field. And now they're exposed to science from all around the world. And actually in the media, we want to see more and more science as well. We're more and more interested in it. So scientists' aspirations for what makes great impact for breakthroughs has gone up enormously. So they want more resources to do that. So partly it might be resetting some of that or deciding how we're going to do that. The other side of it, as you say, is how do we increase the diversity? So one of the things I think is really, a good way to look at science is like an ecosystem, like a natural ecosystem. One of the things we learn from natural ecosystems is that if everything is done the same way, if there is a dominance of a particular species or a particular food chain in that system, it loses resilience and its diversity is contracted, and it's a big problem for that system in the long term. One of the things I now feel about the science ecosystem is the globalization is not wholly good. Because what happens is people use more and more best practice. So the way of funding science in the US is becoming more and more like the way we fund science in the UK or the EU or in China, because people copy the same models. And so the same things get funded everywhere to the same extent. And the problem is then a lack of diversity. So some way to reset that would be good. So actually, I joke that also in the university, I'm in charge of creating anarchy. So I think anarchy is extremely important, or you might call it diversity. So different ways of actually funding science. So we just need more and more examples of this and thinking of ways to enhance this change within the system.
The book is fascinating. It's called The Secret Life of Science. We've been speaking with the book's author, Jeremy Baumberg, who's professor of nanoscience at the University of Cambridge. Not Cambridge, Massachusetts, 3 miles from our studio, but Cambridge, England, of course. Jeremy, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I've got a not great update on the Coinbase hack. I don't want to retell the entire story because a lot of people have heard it several times already, but basically last week we were hacked and several $1,000s in cryptocurrency that we had received for some advertising deals was stolen from our Coinbase account. There was a huge back and forth of about 6 days, a security investigation. Coinbase has both changed their policy about publicly asking for support ticket numbers via Twitter, which was sort of how all of this started. If you look at the Coinbase support Twitter account, you'll see they now are asking for those via direct message. They've also changed their, if you go to the page where you submit a support ticket, they have in red a paragraph specifically related to how the hack against us took place. So clearly they've decided that to some degree the old policy was a liability because they changed it. But they've also decided quite simply that their review of our case is over and they're not compensating us, period. So we kind of have two choices. We can move on with our lives, or we can try to create a problem for them. Would be difficult really to create a problem for them. We're one of more than 20 million Coinbase customers. We spoke to our attorney. He said, listen, I can send a legal letter, but it's probably a waste of time and money because it's not really going to do much at this point. And it's not even clear we can create a big enough sort of public PR problem for them to make a difference. Now, interestingly, I decided to research the addresses that did the hacking. Of course, these addresses, these cryptocurrency addresses are anonymous in the sense that we don't know the names of the people associated with them or the bank accounts associated with them. But what I was able to identify was a series of sort of shell crypto addresses feeding into one primary address that has received about $1 million in Ethereum cryptocurrency of late. So when you see the fact that the people that stole from us have transacted about $1 million in crypto recently, this is not, in a sense, it's not a tiny operation, although compared to the massive hacks that took place at the exchange level, Mt. Gox and others, $1 million is not very much. But we're talking about the theft of a few thousand here and there, adding up to $1 million. This is many, many individual transactions. And of course, statistically, I'm sure many of those were Coinbase users, not all of them. More than likely, we are not going to have much of a choice but to move on. So we will continue growing our support through membership, through Patreon. And one thing we do have going on, Tom Baker, who's been a longtime supporter of the show, he got in touch over the weekend, said, David, I want to help in some way with the Coinbase hack. Let me contribute and do a sponsorship of half of 15 David Pakman Show memberships. So what Tom has done is he's prepaid $30 for 15 people. And what that will now allow is 15 of you to get a half-price membership. That'll get you the bonus show. That'll get you the daily commercial-free audio and video streams of the show. First come, first served. Email in through our website, davidpakman.com. Say, hey, I want one of Tom Baker's memberships. I'll send you a coupon code. And the best part of all of this, other than paying half price once, is that you can keep the half price membership as long as you want. You can renew at half price indefinitely or ad nauseum, as the case may be for some of you. Just get in touch, say, hey, give me one of those Tom Baker memberships at half price, David. We've interviewed anti-gay pastor Scott Lively before on the program. He is known for helping Uganda try to put together one of those kill the gays laws, and he's been a sort of perennial candidate for governor here in Massachusetts. I think he also ran for Senate here in Massachusetts some time ago.
I remember that. I remember him running for governor against Charlie Baker and
in the past.
Someone else. In the general election.
He's run a few times, and he's once again running. He's received enough support at the Massachusetts Republican Party state convention to be on the ballot in their primary. So now anti-gay pastor Scott Lively is in a primary battle against the incumbent Republican governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. I couldn't possibly summarize Scott Lively's outrageous beliefs in one segment, but one highlight, and check out my interview with him for some others, one highlight is that Scott Lively wrote in a book in 1995 that the Nazi Party was controlled by militaristic gay guys who were really the ones that wanted to kill the Jews. And just a little sampling of his views. Lively received the support of 626 of the more than 2,000 delegates to the Massachusetts Republican State Convention. That is twice the requirement to get on the ballot. And obviously, Scott Lively is not going to win the primary. Charlie Baker is popular in Massachusetts. He's very popular among Republicans. He's even sort of popular among some Democrats. He's a sort of decaf Republican in a sense, not a guy I'd vote for, certainly not a Democrat, but in many states, as a Republican, he would be way too far to the left to win any Republican primaries. And that is really what I want to talk about, not only Scott Lively's insane beliefs. There is this dynamic in Massachusetts that people in other states may not understand. Massachusetts, obviously a pretty blue state. There's a situation here where more extreme Republicans can do okay in Massachusetts early on, because just like in most places, some portion of the electorate are dangerous extremists. And of course, these extremists gravitate towards the Republican Party in general. That tends to be the place more than the Democratic Party, where the xenophobes and the homophobes and the conspiracy theorists can get some support. And if the mainstream Republican Party here in Massachusetts were bigger, those extremists would be a smaller percentage of the Republican State Convention. Because the Republican Party in Massachusetts is relatively small, that tiny base of extremists have a sort of comparatively high amount of power. The other reason that Lively received, again, comparatively high levels of support at the convention is because Charlie Baker is so popular among Republicans in Massachusetts that any so-called normal Republican, to the extent that they exist, they're not trying to run against Charlie Baker, right? That means that the non-Baker vote was almost exclusively coalesced around this outrageous extremist Scott Lively. So that it's a weird thing with Massachusetts Republicans, and even the history of Massachusetts electing Republican governors, even though we vote for Democrats in presidential elections. It's a unique thing that you don't see around the country in general. You don't even see it in a lot of blue states, actually.
Bill Weld, Mitt Romney, Charlie Baker, we do have a long history of that. And I remember, like I mentioned before, in the last go-around, he ran for governor against Martha Coakley and Charlie Baker. And, you know, on that debate stage, Baker and Coakley could kind of just brush him off because he was the crazy third-party candidate. They didn't really have to directly respond to him because he had no chance. If it's only Baker and Lively on that debate stage, that's going to legitimize him because Baker's going to have to address him.
There are very few circumstances which would get me to even remotely care about the Republican primary for Massachusetts governor debates. And I hate to admit that bringing a lunatic extremist onto the stage would get me to watch, but I actually am curious merely from the point of view of seeing how Charlie Baker handles Scott Lively. What's the silver lining here? It's hard to find one. I guess it's that Scott Lively isn't denying that the Holocaust happened. he's saying it was orchestrated by gay Nazis. So that's something. It's not an all-out denial of the Holocaust. Is that some kind of silver
Does
lining?
he not remember that gays were also killed in the Holocaust? Certainly not as targeted as Jews were, but they were victims too.
That's part of the conspiracy that apparently we've been fed by the lying fake news or something like that. Would have been actually better for Lively to say it was gay Jews that orchestrated the Holocaust. Why not, right?
Yeah.
Like, just go even further if you need to. We've got a voicemail number. It's 219-2-DAVID-P. We don't have a voicemail today. Today we have an email. I mentioned last week that there are people pressuring me to change the format of the show to an interview-only show. And I said, I think it wouldn't be good for the show. Here's one email I received, and I got a lot of emails like it. This one's from Lisette, who said, Dear David, regarding the discussion about having an interview show versus a news show, if it were an interview-only show, I would immediately cancel my membership in Patreon. That said, it's not because I don't enjoy the interviews. I do enjoy most of them very much. I'm really pressed for time, and I have to work hard to listen to your show and bonus show every day. The main reason that I listen is because I want to hear independent insights on what's going on. The more I know, the more I can talk to others and help to effect change in these trying, to put it mildly, times. But I wouldn't make the time for interviews that I do to hear your take and analysis of the news. What you said about an interview format immediately torpedoing the show sounds about right to me. This was the consensus from people saying, listen, David, what most people, the format of the show is what has built you the audience you have. It would be incredibly risky to say, hey, you know what? Let's do a completely different format altogether. So for the time being, we're not doing any change in format, but we will explore mixing in other formats for individual episodes. We've got a great bonus show today. I'm out of time to tell you what's on it, but it's a good one, and we'll talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.